It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the sun spills in through the kitchen window and you can smell fresh coffee drifting from the pot. Dylan sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, staring absently at the fruit bowl. There, among the bananas and apples, sat a perfectly ripe papaya, its skin golden and freckled, just the way he liked it. For years, papaya had been his morning ritual, a sweet, tropical taste of comfort that seemed to promise health and vitality. But that morning was different. He couldn't look at it the same way anymore. You see, just the day before, Dylan had been at his doctor's office. It wasn't a routine checkup. He'd gone because something felt off. He'd been feeling bloated after meals, his stomach uneasy, his energy dipping faster than usual. And then there was the discomfort, sharp, nagging pains after breakfast that sometimes lingered for hours. He thought it was just stress, maybe the coffee, maybe age creeping in. But when the doctor leaned back in his chair, looking him straight in the eyes, Dylan knew this wasn't just about getting older. The doctor spoke gently but firmly. "Dylan," he said, "it's time we talk about what you're eating and when." He went on to explain that some of Dylan's symptoms were likely tied to something he'd been eating regularly. Dylan listened, frowning, until the doctor mentioned the one food he never expected to hear: papaya. Dylan actually laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of mix-up. Papaya? The very fruit he'd read about in health magazines, the one touted for digestion and immunity, the one his mother used to give him when he was a boy, saying it would keep the doctor away? But the doctor wasn't joking. He explained that while papaya was indeed a wonderful fruit, the way Dylan had been eating it could be doing him more harm than good. Certain combinations, certain timings, even the ripeness of the fruit. These details mattered more than Dylan had ever realized. He felt his stomach twist, not from the fruit this time, but from a creeping sense of betrayal. How could something so healthy be hurting him? That night, Dylan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed replaying the conversation in his mind. He thought about the mornings when he'd slice open a papaya and mix it with yogurt, nuts, even a splash of milk. He thought about the times he'd eaten it after big, heavy dinners, believing it would help him digest. And he thought about the times he'd kept it a little too long on the counter, not wanting to waste it even when the flesh had gone soft and the smell was just a bit too sweet. Was that the problem, or was it something else entirely? The memories reached further back, to when he was just a boy in his grandmother's kitchen. She'd hand him slices of fresh papaya on a warm afternoon, the juice dripping down his fingers as he laughed. It was more than food, it was a piece of home, of love, of tradition. And now here he was, in his 60s, wondering if that same fruit was slowly chipping away at his health. The thought stung more than he expected. Still, Dylan wasn't the type to give in to fear without answers. The next morning, he set out on a quiet mission. He began reading, researching, asking questions. He spoke with nutritionists, scoured medical journals, and even called his sister, who'd always been the health nut in the family. Piece by piece, the picture began to form. Papaya was still good, very good, but it wasn't as simple as slicing it open and digging in. There were traps he hadn't seen, mistakes he'd been making without realizing. And for someone his age, those mistakes carried heavier consequences. One nutritionist told him something that stuck. "Dylan, papaya is like a tool. Used correctly, it can repair, restore, and strengthen. Used incorrectly, it can cause more problems than it solves." That analogy lit a fire in him. He'd been using the wrong end of the tool all these years, and it was time to turn it around. From then on, Dylan approached papaya differently. He paid attention to when he ate it, how he pared it, even the look and feel of the fruit before cutting it open. And slowly, he began to notice changes. The bloating eased, his energy lasted longer through the day, meals left him feeling light, not heavy. It was as if his body was quietly thanking him. But along with that relief came a sobering realization. If he, someone who'd always thought of himself as health conscious, could get it wrong for so long, how many others were making the same mistakes? That's when Dylan decided he had to share what he'd learned, not as a lecture, not as a list of do this, don't do that, but as a story, because stories stick. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there would hear his and avoid the months of discomfort he'd endured. More importantly, maybe they'd learn to use papaya the right way before it cost them more than just a little indigestion. So when I tell you Dylan's story, it's not just about papaya. It's about the little things we overlook, the habits we trust without question, and the ways our bodies try to whisper the truth before they're forced to shout. And in Dylan's case, the truth began with a fruit he thought he knew and ended with a lesson he'll carry for the rest of his life. And if you've ever looked at a papaya the way Dylan once did, bright, harmless, almost medicinal, then I'm going to ask you to stay with me, because before this is over, you might just see it differently. You might even thank Dylan for making the mistake so you don't have to. When Dylan first began eating papaya regularly, it felt like one of the smartest choices he'd ever made for his health. In his mind, it wasn't just a fruit, it was a medicine nature had wrapped in sunshine. Every slice was a little burst of sweet reassurance that he was doing something good for himself. He liked to think of it as his small morning ritual of self-care, something that would help keep his body strong as the years rolled on. The papaya was vibrant, fragrant, and full of promise, and Dylan never thought twice about it. It was safe, or so he believed. It wasn't until a quiet Sunday morning, a few months ago, that Dylan began to notice something was wrong. He had prepared his usual breakfast, a generous plate of papaya alongside yogurt and granola, and sat at his kitchen table, savoring the familiar taste. But instead of feeling light and energized as he usually did, a strange heaviness settled in his stomach. It was the kind of discomfort you try to ignore at first, convincing yourself it will pass. Except this time it didn't. Within an hour, a bloated, uneasy feeling had taken over, and Dylan found himself pacing the living room, trying to walk it off. At first, he dismissed it as a fluke. Maybe he'd eaten too fast, or maybe the yogurt was off. But over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Subtle at first, then more persistent. The connection between the discomfort and his papaya habit wasn't obvious right away. After all, this was a fruit he had eaten for decades without issue. The thought that papaya could somehow be causing the problem seemed absurd. But the discomfort was real, and it was starting to disrupt his mornings in a way he couldn't ignore. Dylan mentioned it casually to his daughter one evening while they were having tea in the backyard. "It's the oddest thing," he said, swirling the spoon in his cup. "I eat papaya, and instead of feeling refreshed, I feel off. Not sick, just heavy, bloated." She raised an eyebrow and suggested he talk to his doctor. Dylan chuckled. "About papaya? He'll think I've lost it." Still, her words lingered in his mind long after she'd gone home. A week later, Dylan finally brought it up during an appointment he had booked for an unrelated checkup. He expected the doctor to shrug it off, but instead the man leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Dylan," he said slowly, "sometimes the healthiest foods can work against us if we're not mindful about how we eat them." Then he began to explain about enzymes, timing, and the way certain food combinations can sabotage digestion rather than support it. "You might be pairing papaya with something that's not helping you," the doctor continued, "or eating it in a way that's harder on your system now than it used to be." The idea unsettled Dylan. He had always thought of papaya as an unconditional gift from nature, pure good, no bad. But now he was hearing that this sweet, familiar fruit could be part of the reason he'd been feeling so sluggish. It was a strange mix of emotions: disbelief, frustration, even a touch of betrayal. He thought of his mornings, how they always began with that vibrant orange flesh and its promise of health. Could it really be turning against him? That night, he sat at his kitchen table with a notebook, jotting down every detail he could remember: what he ate, when he ate it, how he felt afterward. The list grew quickly: yogurt and papaya after a heavy dinner, papaya that had sat on the counter a little too long, papaya eaten late at night when he was restless and couldn't sleep. As the pages filled, Dylan began to see patterns he'd never noticed before. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a coincidence. But habits are stubborn things. The next morning, he hesitated as he reached for the papaya. It was perfect, soft to the touch, fragrant, promising that gentle sweetness he loved. He sliced it open, the bright orange flesh gleaming in the morning light. For a moment, he almost forgot his worries. Then he remembered the doctor's words, and a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He ate it anyway, slower this time, paying attention to every bite. And sure enough, within an hour, the familiar heaviness began to creep in. Dylan leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on his stomach. He realized then that this wasn't going to fix itself. If papaya really was part of the problem, he needed to understand why. He couldn't just give it up without knowing the full story. This fruit had been part of his life for too long, but he also couldn't keep ignoring the signs. Something had changed, and his body was trying to tell him. The question was, what exactly was it saying? That was the moment Dylan's journey truly began. Not just a journey about papaya, but about listening more closely to his body. He decided then and there that he would get to the bottom of it, even if it meant letting go of old habits, even if it meant seeing a fruit he loved in a completely different light. He didn't know yet where that journey would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. This sweet fruit, the one he had trusted for so many years, might not be as innocent as it seemed. The day that truly shifted everything for Dylan didn't start with alarms or drama. It began like so many other mornings in his quiet neighborhood. The sun had just started to peek over the rooftops, painting the sky a pale gold. Birds were making their early chatter, and the faint smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street drifted in through his open kitchen window. Dylan, still in his faded flannel robe, stood at the counter cutting a ripe papaya, its bright orange flesh glowing against the worn wooden cutting board. It was supposed to be just another breakfast. He'd planned to enjoy the papaya with a scoop of yogurt and a sprinkle of granola, maybe linger over his coffee while reading the paper. The first bite was exactly what he expected. Sweet, smooth, almost melting on his tongue. But within minutes of finishing, a strange wave of discomfort rolled in. At first, it was a dull heaviness low in his stomach, but it quickly grew into a bloated tightness that made his waistband feel like it was shrinking. He tried to ignore it, sipping his coffee and turning the newspaper page. But his mind kept circling back to the sensation. It wasn't sharp enough to be called pain, but it was insistent, like his body whispering that something wasn't right. He shifted in his chair, unbuttoned the top of his pajama pants, and hoped it would pass. It didn't. By the time the sun was fully up, Dylan had abandoned his paper and was pacing the kitchen, trying to stretch away the discomfort. It was such an odd thing. Papaya had never done this to him before. In fact, it had always been the fruit he turned to when he wanted to feel light and refreshed. He could remember mornings after long family dinners when a slice of papaya seemed to settle everything in his stomach. Now it felt like the opposite was happening. As he stood by the window watching a neighbor walk their dog, he found himself frowning, wondering if he was imagining it. Maybe it was just the yogurt, maybe it was the coffee. But deep down, a quiet unease had taken root. The rest of that morning didn't go as planned. He had errands to run, but the discomfort made him slow and distracted. By the time he returned home, the bloating had faded, but a lingering heaviness stayed with him. It wasn't enough to ruin his day, but it was enough to make him notice, and notice again the next morning when it happened all over, and again the day after that. That's when he started to think back, trying to remember if there had been other hints he had ignored. There was that afternoon a few weeks ago when he'd felt sluggish for hours after eating papaya with a sandwich. There was the night he'd had it after a big pasta dinner and couldn't sleep comfortably. He had always dismissed these moments as coincidence, but now they seemed to form a pattern he couldn't deny. It was unsettling, realizing that something so familiar and comforting could be linked to this new discomfort. Dylan thought of how often we accept small changes in our bodies as just aging. A little less energy, a little more indigestion, a little more stiffness in the mornings. It's easy to brush it all aside. But that morning, standing barefoot in his kitchen with his stomach tight and restless, Dylan decided he couldn't just ignore this one. When he told his friend Harold about it later that week, Harold laughed at first. Papaya? Come on, that's a superfood. My wife swears by it. Dylan smiled politely, but kept his thoughts to himself. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to be the one to question the golden reputation of a fruit that had been praised in every health magazine and morning talk show segment. But he also knew his body wasn't lying to him. Something about the way he'd been eating papaya was no longer working, and maybe, just maybe, it was never as simple as he had thought. That morning, the morning that changed everything, wasn't dramatic in the way life-changing moments often are in stories. There was no emergency room visit, no panicked phone call, no life flashing before his eyes. It was quieter than that. Just a man, a kitchen, a plate of fruit, and the dawning realization that something needed to change. Dylan didn't yet know that this would lead him to uncover mistakes people had been making with papaya for years. He didn't know he'd soon be rethinking every way he'd ever eaten it. But as he stood there washing his empty plate, a thought took root. Maybe the answer wasn't in giving up the fruit he loved, but in learning how to eat it right. And that thought would guide him through the weeks to come as he began piecing together the small truths that would change not only his mornings, but his health. In the days after that unsettling morning, Dylan found himself torn. Part of him wanted to push the papaya aside to clear space in the fruit bowl for something safer, but another part couldn't quite let it go. He had so many good memories wrapped around this fruit: breakfasts on the patio in the spring air, slices shared with his daughter during Sunday visits, the cooling sweetness on hot summer afternoons. To simply abandon it felt almost like cutting off a piece of himself. So instead of turning away from papaya completely, Dylan decided to step closer. If this fruit truly was causing him trouble, he needed to understand it, really understand it, before making any decisions. He started by digging into what had always made papaya special in the first place. And as he read, listened, and remembered, he began to see why he had fallen in love with it all those years ago. Papaya, he learned, was more than just a tropical treat. It was a natural helper, loaded with compounds that could make a real difference for someone his age. He thought back to his younger days when digestion was effortless. Now, meals seemed to linger longer in his stomach than they once had. That's where papaya's natural enzyme, papain, came in, slicing through proteins and easing the work for a slowing digestive system. It was like having a quiet, unseen helper in his kitchen, working behind the scenes so he could feel light and comfortable after eating. And it wasn't just digestion. He discovered that papaya was rich in vitamin C, more than he ever realized, enough to help shore up the immune system in a single serving. For someone in his 60s, that mattered. Winters could be harsh on his body, and even a small cold could take longer to shake off. Papaya, with its bright sweetness, wasn't just a snack. It was a quiet form of defense. He also remembered something his mother used to say when she would hand him a wedge of the orange fruit on a summer day. "It keeps you looking young, Dylan." Back then, he thought she was just trying to get him to eat more fruit. But now he read about the antioxidants in papaya, vitamin A, beta-carotene, compounds that could help keep skin supple and strong, working against the little lines and spots that come with time. Maybe, without realizing it, he'd been giving his body small gifts all along. The deeper Dylan went, the more respect he felt for papaya. He thought about his eyesight, still sharp, but not as crisp as it used to be. The lutein and zeaxanthin in papaya were like a shield for the eyes, guarding them against the slow wear of age. Even his heart stood to gain from the soluble fiber, which could help keep cholesterol in check. And as he sat at his kitchen table with an open notebook, listing all these benefits, he felt a little lighter. This wasn't about turning against papaya, not yet. It was about learning how to make it work for him again. He decided he would keep it in his diet, but on his own terms. No more blindly slicing it open without a thought for when or how he was eating it. If papaya was truly the healing food it claimed to be, he would give it the chance to be just that. But to do so, he needed to stop treating it like a casual snack and start treating it like the powerful ally it was. That night, Dylan went to bed with a new kind of determination. The next chapter of his journey wasn't going to be about fear. It was going to be about respect. Respect for the fruit, respect for his body, and respect for the small choices that could either help or hurt him. He didn't know yet exactly what changes he would make, but he felt the shift inside him. He was ready to learn, and he was ready to listen, both to the science and to the quiet signals his body had been sending him all along. Dylan's fascination with papaya had always been about its taste, but now it was becoming something deeper. He found himself leaning over articles late into the evening, reading about this thing called papain. The name sounded almost mysterious, like a word out of an old herbal medicine book. Yet the more he read, the more he realized this enzyme wasn't some hidden secret from far-off jungles. It was simply the beating heart of what made papaya so powerful. Papain, he learned, wasn't just a digestive aid in the casual sense. It didn't simply help your stomach the way vague health tips often promise. No, it worked in a very real, very tangible way, breaking down protein molecules into smaller pieces so the body could handle them with ease. Dylan pictured it almost like a pair of tiny, invisible scissors snipping away at the heavy knots in his meals, turning them into soft strands his system could manage without strain. That image stuck with him. It explained so much, why he had always felt so light after eating papaya in his younger years, why it seemed to help him bounce back from heavier meals. Papain wasn't just working in his stomach, it was freeing up his whole body, saving it from the extra effort of wrestling with food it didn't quite know what to do with. In a way, it had been quietly protecting him for decades, and he'd never even thanked it. But here was the part that caught his attention. Papain was delicate. It wasn't some indestructible force that worked no matter what. The articles and nutrition notes were clear. Papain could be weakened, even neutralized by the wrong conditions. Heat could destroy it. Certain food pairings could block it. And if papaya was too ripe, the balance shifted. The enzyme's benefits faded into something less helpful, sometimes even irritating to the stomach. Dylan thought back to all the times he'd eaten papaya after a big dinner, pairing it with dairy or processed sweets, thinking he was doing his digestion a favor. He winced. All those moments when he thought he was helping his body, he might have been giving papain the exact conditions it couldn't thrive in. It was like handing a skilled craftsman a broken tool and asking for perfect work. No wonder his body had started to protest. One memory floated to the surface, a trip he'd taken to Costa Rica years ago. He'd stayed at a small family-run inn, and every morning they served him fresh papaya on a plate. Nothing else, just the fruit in its clean, unadorned glory. He remembered feeling light and strong all week, his energy steady and his digestion effortless. It wasn't just the tropical air, it was the way the fruit had been served, pure, simple, undisturbed. He'd never connected the dots until now. It made him realize something important. Papaya, and especially its magical papain, worked best when given the space to do its job. It didn't need company from heavy foods, didn't want to fight through layers of bread, cheese, and sauces. It thrived in stillness, in simplicity, in being the main focus rather than the side act. That, Dylan decided, was the secret he had overlooked for years. From that day, he started to think about papaya, the way you'd think about a good conversation with an old friend. You don't interrupt it with noise or distractions, you give it your full attention. He began experimenting, eating papaya first thing in the morning before anything else touched his plate. And slowly something changed. The heaviness he had felt before didn't come. The bloating eased. It was as if the papain was finally able to work its quiet magic again, no longer smothered by the wrong combinations. As the days passed, Dylan realized that papain wasn't just an enzyme in a fruit. It was a reminder that even the best things in life need the right conditions to shine. He had spent years unknowingly dulling its edge, and now at last he was letting it work the way it was meant to. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, no fireworks or miracles, just a steady, gentle return to the way things should feel. It was a slow Sunday morning when Dylan first noticed the change. He was standing in front of his bathroom mirror, running a razor carefully along his jawline, when he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in a way he hadn't in years. There was something different, something softer about the skin under his eyes, a warmth in his complexion that hadn't been there before. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. His skin looked alive. He chuckled under his breath. At 64, he wasn't expecting miracles. Wrinkles were part of the deal, and he wore them without shame, but there was no denying the shift. The faint dullness that had crept in over the past few years seemed to have lifted. Even the little patch of dryness near his temple was less noticeable. It struck him then that the only real change he'd made in recent weeks was the way he was eating papaya. It made sense when he thought about it. The papaya wasn't just helping his digestion, it was feeding his skin from the inside out. The vitamins A and C, the beta-carotene, all those bright-colored nutrients he'd read about were quietly repairing and nourishing him in ways creams never could. He realized now why his mother's old saying about papaya keeping you young had lingered in his mind all these years. She'd known something, even if she couldn't explain it in scientific terms. But the changes weren't only skin deep. Around the same time, Dylan began to notice something else. His energy felt steadier. He wasn't getting those mid-morning crashes that used to have him reaching for a second cup of coffee or a sweet snack. There was a calm, even current running through his days now. At first, he didn't connect it to his fruit habit, but a conversation with his doctor helped him see the link. The doctor explained that papaya's low glycemic index meant it didn't send his blood sugar soaring and then crashing the way pastries or sugary fruits could. Combined with its fiber, papaya slowed the release of natural sugars into his bloodstream, giving him a more stable kind of fuel. That stability showed up in ways Dylan could feel. He was less irritable in the late mornings, more focused when working on his wood carving projects in the afternoons, and even sleeping better at night. One afternoon, while visiting his daughter, he found himself playing tag with his granddaughter in the backyard. It had been a long time since he'd chased anyone around for more than a few minutes, but somehow he kept up. Later, as he sat catching his breath under the shade of the old oak tree, he thought about how different he'd felt a month ago, sluggish, heavy, and tired. Now there was a lightness in his body, a readiness he hadn't expected to return. The thought made him smile. He had started this journey because something felt wrong. Now he was realizing that the right changes could give him more than relief. They could give him back pieces of himself he thought he'd left behind. Papaya wasn't a cure-all, he knew that. But it was a tool, and in the right hands, at the right time, it was proving to be more powerful than he'd imagined. That night, sitting by the window with a plate of neatly sliced papaya, Dylan savored each bite slowly. It wasn't just food anymore, it was part of a quiet, personal ritual of care. And as the sweetness lingered on his tongue, he knew this was only the beginning of what he had yet to learn. There were still traps to avoid, still mistakes he could fall into if he wasn't careful. But for now, he was content. The fruit in his hands was helping him in ways far beyond what he'd once believed, from the reflection in the mirror to the strength in his step. It was a Wednesday, one of those midweek days where Dylan liked to keep things simple. He had a morning errand to run, a light lunch planned, and an evening set aside for reading. Nothing stressful, nothing demanding. That morning, he decided to treat himself to a bigger breakfast than usual. Thick slices of toasted bread, scrambled eggs, a small cup of coffee, and of course, a generous portion of papaya. It looked beautiful on his plate, the golden orange flesh catching the morning light. He felt almost proud, thinking he was starting his day with something so healthy. The first few bites were perfect, sweet, soft, refreshing. But as he moved through his breakfast, a familiar unease began to stir. It wasn't immediate, but halfway through tidying up the kitchen, he felt a tightening in his abdomen, as though a knot was forming inside. At first, he brushed it off as just being full, but the discomfort kept growing, shifting from a dull heaviness to something sharper, almost like his stomach was pushing back against him. By late morning, he found himself leaning on the edge of the counter, pressing a palm against his midsection. The bloating was worse than he remembered, and there was a faint, sour taste in his mouth that made him think of acid reflux. He tried walking it off, sipping water, even lying down for a bit. But nothing seemed to settle it. It puzzled him. He'd eaten papaya so many times without trouble. So why was it hitting him harder now? That afternoon, he skipped lunch, hoping to give his stomach a break. But the bloating stayed with him, dragging his energy down and clouding his thoughts. He sat in his armchair by the window, looking out at the quiet street, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. How could the very fruit that had been giving him more energy, better digestion, and clearer skin suddenly be turning against him? The answer came later that evening when he sat down with his notebook. As he flipped back through his food log, the one he'd been keeping since his first bout of discomfort, a pattern jumped out at him. The worst days, the ones where the bloating lingered, had something in common. He had eaten papaya after a heavier meal or alongside certain rich foods. That morning's breakfast was a perfect example. Eggs, bread, coffee, and papaya all together. It was as if the fruit's magic enzyme, papain, had been crowded out, unable to do its job, leaving his stomach to fend for itself. And then he remembered what his doctor had once said about timing. The right food at the wrong time is still the wrong food. It rang in his ears now, carrying a weight he hadn't fully understood before. Dylan realized that even a healthy habit, done carelessly, could slip into becoming a harmful one. This wasn't about papaya being good or bad. It was about the way he was treating it, tossing it into his meals without thought, expecting it to work miracles no matter the circumstances. By the end of the day, Dylan made himself a quiet promise. He would stop taking papaya for granted. He would respect its strengths and its limits, learn when and how to eat it so it could help rather than harm him. And as the discomfort slowly eased that night, he knew this was a turning point. The fruit he loved hadn't betrayed him. He had simply misunderstood it. Now it was time to set things right. It was early summer when Dylan noticed the papaya on his counter starting to look tired. Its golden skin was now blotched with deep brown patches, and the sweet, musky scent had grown stronger, almost perfumed. He picked it up gently, feeling the flesh give under his fingers. Too soft. He knew it was past its peak, but he hesitated. Throwing food away never sat right with him. Growing up, his mother had always said, "We don't waste what nature gives us." So against his better judgment, he decided to eat it anyway. He cut it open, and the knife sank in with barely any resistance. The flesh was darker, almost translucent, with a faint fizz in its aroma that reminded him of fruit left too long in the sun. Still, Dylan convinced himself it would be fine. He scooped out the seeds, sliced it onto a plate, and took a bite. The sweetness was intense, richer than usual, but not unpleasant. He ate the rest quickly, thinking he'd done the sensible thing by saving it from the bin. It didn't take long for him to realize his mistake. Barely an hour later, his stomach began to churn in a way he hadn't felt before. This wasn't the slow, heavy bloating he'd experienced in the past. This was sharper, more urgent. A wave of nausea rose, and he found himself sitting still, breathing slowly, hoping it would pass. But it lingered. That evening, he felt weak and restless, his appetite gone. He knew in his gut, quite literally, that the overripe papaya was the culprit. The next day, after some restless sleep, Dylan decided to look deeper into why it had hit him so hard. He learned that as papaya becomes overripe, its natural sugars concentrate and fermentation can begin. Those tiny bubbles he had smelled weren't just his imagination. They were a sign the fruit had started to break down. For a sensitive digestive system, especially in someone his age, that fermentation could be an irritant, triggering everything from stomach cramps to mild food poisoning. And the higher sugar content could give blood sugar an unwelcome spike, even in a low glycemic fruit like papaya. What struck him most was how invisible the risk seemed. Most people, himself included, thought of papaya as safe no matter what, soft, sweet, and forgiving. But in reality, overripe fruit was a different creature entirely. It wasn't just less nutritious, it could actively work against the very health benefits he was chasing. Dylan thought back to all the times he'd eaten papaya that was a little too soft, telling himself it was still good. How many of those quiet afternoons with a slightly off papaya had ended in him feeling sluggish or unwell? How many times had he mistaken that discomfort for just getting older? The realization left him uneasy. From that day forward, he became choosy about his papayas. He looked for fruit that was ripe but still firm to the touch, fragrant but not overwhelming. If it was too far gone, he let it go, no matter how much he hated waste. And on the days when a papaya was perfect, he treated it almost like an occasion. Fresh slices, eaten slowly without rushing, no guilt, no second-guessing, just the clean sweetness of a fruit at its best. It was a small change, but it felt like a quiet act of respect for his health, for his body, and for the food itself. And slowly, the overripe trap stopped catching him. For most of his life, Dylan believed papaya was the perfect after-meal companion. It was how his mother served it, after Sunday lunches, after family gatherings, after a big roast dinner in winter. She'd place the slices on a tray, their orange glow like small sunsets on porcelain plates, and everyone would nibble at them as the conversation lingered. Dylan had carried that tradition into his own adulthood, serving papaya after heavy meals, convinced it was helping him digest. One evening not long after the overripe incident, Dylan put that old belief to the test without realizing it. He had invited his old friend Harold over for dinner. They cooked together, roast chicken with buttery potatoes, a crisp green salad, and a crusty baguette. It was a hearty, satisfying meal, the kind that leaves you leaning back in your chair with a happy sigh. And just as he had always done, Dylan brought out a plate of freshly cut papaya for dessert, proud of his healthy choice. The fruit was perfect that night, firm, fragrant, exactly the kind he now knew to choose. But within half an hour of eating it, Dylan felt the familiar swell of discomfort in his abdomen. At first, he tried to ignore it, joining Harold in reminiscing about old fishing trips and family milestones. But soon he was shifting in his chair, his waistband feeling uncomfortably tight. A low, pressing bloat settled in, and he knew without a doubt that this wasn't just too much dinner. That night, after Harold left, Dylan sat down with his notebook again. He flipped back through his recent entries and saw the pattern so clearly it startled him. Every time he'd eaten papaya after a large, heavy meal, the bloating came back. It didn't seem to matter if the fruit was perfectly ripe. The timing was wrong. He remembered what his doctor had told him weeks earlier. When the stomach is already full and working hard to break down rich, complex foods, throwing papaya into the mix isn't a kindness. It's an overload. The enzymes in papaya, especially papain, work best when they're not competing with a flood of other foods, especially fatty or protein-heavy ones. Instead of speeding digestion, the papaya just sits in the crowded stomach, beginning to ferment, producing gas and discomfort. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Those beautiful Sunday desserts from his childhood? They'd been followed by long naps on the couch, everyone stuffed and sluggish. He had always blamed the heavy lunch, never considering that the papaya, meant to help, might have been quietly adding to the strain. From then on, Dylan made a quiet rule for himself. Papaya was for mornings or between meals, never immediately after. He began enjoying it first thing after waking, when his stomach was calm and ready for something light. The difference was almost immediate. No bloating, no discomfort, just that clean, sweet freshness he had fallen in love with decades ago. It was a small change, but one that shifted his relationship with the fruit entirely. Papaya no longer felt like a gamble. It felt like an ally again, as long as he gave it the respect it deserved. And in a way, it was another reminder of something he was learning more and more at this stage of life. Even the good things need the right timing to work their magic. It happened on a rainy afternoon at the farmer's market. Dylan was browsing through the stalls, umbrella tucked under his arm, when he came across a pile of small, green papayas stacked neatly on a wooden crate. They were nothing like the glowing, golden-orange fruits he usually bought. Their skin was smooth, dark green, and firm as stone. The vendor smiled and said, "Perfect for salads or stews, very healthy." Dylan had heard of green papaya salad before, a tangy, crunchy dish served in Southeast Asian restaurants, but he had never tried making it at home. Something about the idea appealed to him. Maybe it was the novelty, or maybe it was his growing curiosity about all the different ways papaya could be eaten. So, without much thought, he bought two. That evening, back in his kitchen, he peeled one and cut it into thin strips. The flesh was pale, almost white-green, and a milky liquid oozed from the skin and onto the cutting board. He wiped it away with a cloth and thought nothing of it. There was no recipe, no boiling or marinating, just a quick toss with lime juice and a sprinkle of salt. It looked fresh, crisp, and inviting. The first few bites were pleasant enough, crunchy, mild, with a hint of tang from the lime. But within an hour, Dylan's stomach began to feel unsettled. It wasn't the deep bloating he knew from before. This was sharper, with a faint nausea rising in his throat. He sat quietly at his table, frowning, trying to think what could have caused it. By the next morning, the discomfort had eased, but he still felt sluggish, with a faint sourness lingering in his belly. When he mentioned it to his doctor a few days later, the man nodded knowingly. "That's the latex," he said. Dylan blinked in surprise. The doctor explained that unripe green papaya contains a milky latex, concentrated just under the skin, which can irritate the stomach lining if eaten raw. For some people, especially those with sensitive digestion or mild latex allergies, it can trigger nausea, cramping, or even vomiting. Dylan thought back to that sticky, milky liquid on his cutting board. He had wiped it away without realizing that was the very thing that had caused his discomfort. The doctor went on to say that green papaya was perfectly safe once properly prepared. Cooking, boiling, fermenting, or thorough marinating could neutralize the latex. But eating it raw, straight from the peel, was risky. It was another small but important lesson for Dylan. He realized that the fruit he thought he knew still had layers of complexity he hadn't uncovered. He thought of all the little mistakes he had made in the past: overripe fruit, bad timing, careless pairings, and now the green papaya trap. Each one seemed harmless on its own, but together they could undo the very benefits he was chasing. From then on, Dylan treated green papaya with the same care he gave the ripe ones. If he wanted to try it in a salad, he'd look for recipes that called for blanching or marinating it first. If he used it in soups, he made sure it had been boiled until tender. And slowly, he began to appreciate it for what it was: a different kind of papaya, one that could be a friend to his health, but only if handled with respect. It was during one of his regular check-ins with his daughter Claire that Dylan first heard the words papain sensitivity. She had stopped by one Saturday morning with a bag of groceries, insisting on making breakfast together. As she set down the eggs, bread, and a ripe papaya, she casually mentioned a story about a friend from her yoga class. Apparently, this friend had been feeling unwell after eating papaya, not bloated or heavy like Dylan had experienced, but itchy, flushed, and swollen in the lips. At first, she thought it was an allergic reaction to something else in her meal, but after a few more incidents, she realized it always happened after papaya. Eventually, her doctor confirmed it. She was allergic to papain, the very enzyme that made papaya so beneficial for most people. Dylan listened with a mix of curiosity and concern. He had never considered that someone could be allergic to papain itself. For him, papaya had been more of a puzzle than a danger. But now he thought back to the last few months. Were there times when he had felt an odd tingling on his tongue? Maybe a faint scratchiness in his throat? They had been so mild that he'd dismissed them instantly, chalking them up to dry air or a sip of coffee too hot. That evening, curiosity got the better of him. He sat down with his laptop and searched papain allergy. What he found was both reassuring and sobering. For most people, papain was harmless, even healing. But for a small percentage, it could trigger allergic reactions ranging from mild itching to severe swelling, breathing difficulties, and in rare cases, anaphylaxis. And unlike seasonal allergies, papain sensitivity could show up suddenly, even in someone who had eaten papaya for years without trouble. The thought unsettled Dylan. He imagined sitting at his kitchen table one morning, enjoying a bowl of papaya as he always did, only to find his lips swelling or his throat tightening. He didn't want to believe it could happen to him, and yet, wasn't that what he had thought about bloating, overripe fruit, and green papaya too? Over the next week, Dylan began paying closer attention to how his body responded after each serving. He noticed that when he ate papaya in larger amounts, he sometimes got a faint tingling on his lips. It wasn't alarming, but it was enough to make him cautious. He decided to be deliberate, smaller portions, eaten slowly with a glass of water nearby. He also told Claire about his observations. She didn't want to worry him, but she urged him to be careful. "Dad, just promise me you'll pay attention. Your body's smarter than you think. If it's sending you a message, don't ignore it." Those words stayed with him. He realized that part of this whole journey wasn't just about papaya. It was about learning to listen more closely to his body, the subtle signals, the whispers that come before the shouts. Whether or not he ever developed a full-blown papain allergy, he wanted to be the kind of person who didn't dismiss what his body was trying to say. And so, with a newfound respect for even the smallest reactions, Dylan carried on. Papaya was still in his life, but it no longer arrived on his plate by habit alone. It came with intention, awareness, and an understanding that even the healthiest foods can hold quiet risks. It didn't happen overnight. Dylan didn't wake up one morning, snap his fingers, and suddenly know exactly how to eat papaya without discomfort. Instead, it was a gradual process, a mix of trial, error, and a lot of listening to his own body. But somewhere along the way, he began to notice that the puzzle pieces were falling into place. One morning, he decided to start with a completely clean slate. No heavy breakfast, no coffee yet, no toast or eggs or yogurt. Just papaya, perfectly ripe, cut into neat slices, eaten slowly. He sat by the kitchen window with his plate and a glass of water, watching the sunlight shift across the counter. The first bite was cool and sweet. The second was softer, almost melting. And by the last bite, he felt light, calm, and satisfied. Not weighed down, not bloated, not restless. It was such a simple change, but it made an enormous difference. Eating papaya first thing in the morning on an empty stomach gave it the space to work its magic. The papain could do its job without competing with other heavy foods. His digestion felt smoother, his energy steadier. He even noticed that when he had papaya in the morning, he was less likely to crave sugary snacks later in the day. Encouraged, Dylan began experimenting with other small changes. Instead of tossing the seeds into the trash, he started saving a teaspoon or so, crushing them lightly and mixing them into a smoothie. At first, the peppery taste caught him off guard, but he quickly grew used to it. He'd read that the seeds were rich in enzymes and antioxidants, a kind of bonus gift from the fruit, and he liked the idea of using every part of the papaya. He also started paying close attention to ripeness. Gone were the days of good enough fruit. He would pick up each papaya at the market and gently press it with his thumb, looking for just the right give, soft, but still firm enough to hold its shape. If the skin was covered in brown blotches or the smell was too strong, he left it behind, no matter how much it cost or how much he hated wasting food. And if a papaya at home began to tip toward overripe, he made sure to eat it that same day or not at all. Another change he made was in timing. If he missed his morning window for papaya, he didn't try to make up for it by eating it right after lunch or dinner. He'd learned his lesson there. Instead, he kept it for a light afternoon snack, maybe with a sprinkle of chia seeds or a squeeze of fresh lime. He noticed that when papaya was the star of the show, not an afterthought crammed in after a big meal, it treated him kindly. One of the biggest shifts, though, wasn't just in how he ate papaya, but in how he thought about it. Before, papaya was just something he liked, a fruit he reached for without much thought. Now it was part of his health ritual, something he approached with intention. Each time he sliced into one, he reminded himself that this was more than just breakfast. It was a quiet act of care for his digestion, his immune system, and his overall well-being. There was one morning in particular that stood out. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the curtains as he sat at his kitchen table. He'd cut his papaya into small cubes and sprinkled them with a touch of fresh lime juice. He took his time, savoring each bite, and for the first time in months, he realized he wasn't thinking about whether it would cause him discomfort later. He was simply enjoying it. That sense of ease, of trust between himself and the food, felt like a small but meaningful victory. His daughter, Claire, noticed the difference too. One afternoon, as they walked together in the park, she said, "You seem lighter lately, Dad, happier. Even your skin looks brighter." Dylan smiled and told her about his new routine. She listened, nodding, then laughed. "All that from papaya?" she teased. But he could tell she was genuinely interested. And truthfully, it wasn't just the papaya, it was the fact that he had learned to work with his body instead of against it. There was also a certain peace that came with letting go of old habits that no longer served him. In the past, he'd stubbornly clung to the way he'd always done things. Eating papaya after meals because that's how his mother had served it. Buying fruit on sale even if it wasn't perfect. Pairing it with whatever else was on his plate. Now he realized that aging well meant adjusting, refining, and sometimes rewriting the rules you'd lived by for decades. Even his mornings felt different now. They had a rhythm, a sense of gentle purpose. He'd wake up, drink a glass of water, prepare his papaya, and eat it slowly. Some days he added a few papaya seeds to his smoothie. Other days he paired it with a handful of nuts for a little extra protein. But no matter the variation, he always gave it the space and attention it deserved. Over time, the changes became second nature. The bloating that had once plagued him was gone. His digestion felt steady, his energy was stronger, and his mood more even. And while he knew papaya wasn't the only reason for those improvements, he couldn't deny that learning how to eat it properly had played a big part. He thought back to those early days of discomfort when he'd been tempted to give up on papaya entirely. What a shame it would have been to lose out on something so good simply because he hadn't yet learned how to use it well. That, he realized, was the heart of the lesson. The healthiest foods can only help us if we meet them halfway. For Dylan, eating papaya the right way wasn't just about avoiding discomfort. It was about creating a small, daily act of nourishment that supported his body and reminded him to slow down. It was about respect for the fruit, for the traditions that had brought it to his table, and for the body that carried him through each day. And so, papaya remained a bright, familiar presence in his kitchen. No longer a source of worry, no longer a question mark, just a simple, sweet ally in his ongoing journey to care for himself. One thoughtful bite at a time. By now, Dylan's mornings had taken on a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Long before the world around him was fully awake, he'd be in his kitchen, sunlight just beginning to spill across the counter, a ripe papaya resting in his hands. He no longer rushed this moment. It was a quiet ritual, one he treated almost like a form of meditation. He had discovered through experience that mornings were the sweet spot for papaya. On an empty stomach, his body seemed to welcome it with open arms. The papain went straight to work, easing digestion for the rest of the day, almost like setting a calm foundation before the busier meals to come. There was no bloating, no heaviness, just a gentle, satisfying start. One morning, as he sliced the fruit open, Dylan thought about how different this was from his old routine. Back then, mornings were crowded. Toast, coffee, maybe eggs, sometimes leftovers if he was feeling indulgent. Papaya was an afterthought, squeezed in alongside heavier foods. It had never had the chance to shine. Now it was the centerpiece, and strangely enough, starting his day this way didn't just affect his digestion, it shifted his mindset. He found himself making better choices for lunch and dinner as though the first act of kindness toward his body set the tone for everything that followed. If he began with something light and clean, he didn't want to undo it with processed snacks or greasy takeout. He also noticed his energy curve had changed. In the past, by mid-morning, he'd often feel a slow dip, the kind that had him reaching for another cup of coffee or a biscuit to keep going. But with papaya as his first meal, his energy felt steadier. The natural sugars gave him a gentle lift without the crash. The fiber kept him satisfied until lunch. And the hydration, papaya being mostly water, made him feel refreshed from the inside out. Claire picked up on the difference too. On one of her Saturday visits, she caught him at the kitchen table, a small plate of papaya in front of him. She laughed. You look like you're on vacation, Dad. It's the middle of winter and you've got tropical fruit like you're in Hawaii. Dylan grinned. It's the best part of my day, he said honestly. She tried a slice herself and admitted it was better than she'd expected, soft and sweet without being cloying. Over time, Dylan began experimenting with little touches to keep the ritual fresh. Some mornings he'd add a squeeze of lime, brightening the flavor and boosting the vitamin C content. Other days he sprinkled on chia seeds for extra fiber or a few mint leaves from the small pot on his windowsill. Each variation felt like a small celebration, a reminder that even the simplest foods could offer variety and joy. The morning papaya also became a quiet checkpoint for him, a way of noticing how he was feeling before the demands of the day swept in. If he felt more tired than usual, he'd slow down. If he was feeling particularly good, he'd take an extra minute to savor the moment. It was, in a way, a conversation between himself and his body, with papaya as the opening line. He remembered a conversation with his doctor not long ago where the man had said, "Your first meal is like the first step on a long walk. If you start steady, you're more likely to finish strong." Dylan had nodded then, but now he felt he truly understood it. By giving papaya the first place in his day, he was starting steady, not just for his digestion, but for his overall well-being. One chilly morning, he thought back to his early struggles with papaya, the bloating, the discomfort, the confusion over how something so healthy could make him feel so off. He smiled at how far he'd come. The answer hadn't been to give it up, but to give it the respect it needed. And in return, it had become one of his greatest health allies. There was something deeply reassuring about that. It reminded him that many of life's solutions aren't about dramatic overhauls, but about small, thoughtful adjustments. Sometimes it's as simple as changing when you do something. Sometimes that's all it takes to turn a problem into a gift. Now, whether the day ahead was busy with errands, quiet with reading, or full of visits with friends, Dylan started it the same way. A plate of perfectly ripe papaya, enjoyed slowly in the soft morning light. It was more than breakfast. It was a reminder that taking care of himself didn't have to be complicated. It could be as simple as a fruit, a fork, and a few mindful minutes at the start of each day. For years, Dylan had tossed papaya seeds into the bin without a second thought. They were just the inedible clutter in the middle of the fruit, slick, black, and a little bit bitter looking. He never imagined they could hold any real value. But that changed one afternoon when he stumbled across a small article in a health magazine left behind at his local coffee shop. The piece was about forgotten parts of common foods, and papaya seeds were right at the top of the list. The author claimed they were packed with enzymes, antioxidants, and even compounds that could help fight harmful bacteria in the gut. Dylan was skeptical. He'd heard plenty of bold claims about superfoods before, and many turned out to be more hype than truth. But something about the idea stayed with him. A few mornings later, as he sliced open a perfectly ripe papaya, he paused before scraping the seeds into the compost bin. They looked almost like tiny black pearls, clustered together in the pale cavity of the fruit. He picked one up and rolled it between his fingers. Why not give them a try? The first taste was a surprise, peppery, almost spicy, with a faint bitterness that reminded him of watercress. It wasn't unpleasant, just unexpected. He chewed one or two, then decided to mix a small spoonful into his morning smoothie to temper the sharpness. The result was subtle, and he found himself intrigued enough to keep experimenting. Soon, Dylan learned that moderation was key. The seeds were potent, and a little went a long way. A teaspoon crushed into a smoothie or stirred into yogurt was more than enough. He also discovered an old folk remedy, mixing crushed papaya seeds with a drizzle of raw honey, then taking it first thing in the morning for a few days in a row. Supposedly, it could help balance gut bacteria and gently cleanse the digestive system. He decided to try it. On the first morning, he mashed the seeds with the back of a spoon, added the honey, and let the mixture sit for a few minutes. The result was an earthy sweet paste with a faint kick from the seeds. He took it slowly, letting the flavors mingle on his tongue. The pepperiness cut through the honey's sweetness in a way that somehow felt invigorating, like a wake-up call for his taste buds. Over the next week, Dylan noticed subtle changes. His digestion, which was already better thanks to his morning papaya ritual, seemed even more settled. Meals felt lighter, and the occasional afternoon sluggishness he used to feel was less noticeable. Whether it was the seeds, the honey, or simply the act of paying more attention to what he was eating, he couldn't say for sure. But he liked the feeling and the ritual that came with it. He shared his discovery with Claire one weekend, offering her a taste of the honey seed mixture. She made a face at the first bite, then laughed. "It's like a spicy dessert," she said, surprised. Dylan told her about the potential digestive benefits, the antioxidants, and how he'd read that in some cultures, papaya seeds had been used for generations as a natural tonic. She raised her eyebrows and admitted she might have to give them a try herself. For Dylan, the seeds became more than just an add-on to his diet. They were a symbol of his shift in perspective, proof that even the parts of life we overlook can hold quiet treasures. He thought about how many years he had thrown them away without realizing what he was losing. It reminded him of the broader lesson he'd been learning all along. Health isn't just about the obvious choices, it's also about noticing the small, hidden things and giving them a chance to work for you. In a way, the seeds mirrored his own journey. At first glance, they didn't seem important, but with a little attention and care, they revealed a depth of value he hadn't expected. And just as he'd learned to respect the ripeness of the fruit and the timing of his meals, he now respected these tiny, potent gifts that came hidden inside each papaya. Now, when Dylan sliced open a papaya in the morning, he didn't just see the golden flesh. He saw the whole picture, the fruit and the seeds, each offering something unique. It felt good to know he was using every part of it, honoring the whole food rather than just the most obvious part. And each time he sprinkled those tiny black pearls into his blender or mixed them with honey, he smiled at the thought that even the smallest things could hold big secrets. It was a breezy Saturday morning when Dylan found himself wandering the aisles of the local farmer's market. He had gone there for papaya, but the bright displays of seasonal produce pulled him in every direction. Juicy oranges stacked in neat pyramids, baskets of blueberries glistening under the early light, bunches of fresh mint tied with string. As he moved from stall to stall, an idea began to take root. What if papaya could be even better when paired with other foods? Up until now, he had been eating papaya mostly on its own, savoring its clean sweetness in the quiet of his mornings. That approach had worked beautifully for his digestion, but as he eyed the colorful bounty around him, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more he could do. A way to unlock even greater benefits from his favorite fruit. He started with something simple, a squeeze of fresh lime over his morning papaya slices. The tartness sharpened the sweetness of the fruit, making each bite brighter. But it wasn't just about taste. He'd read that the extra vitamin C in lime could work alongside papaya's antioxidants to support his immune system. A small change, but it felt like a meaningful one. Next, he tried sprinkling chia seeds on top. At first, he did it for the texture. He liked the slight crunch against the soft fruit. But then he learned that chia seeds were rich in omega-3s and fiber, adding an extra layer of heart and digestive health support to his breakfast. It was like building a little health alliance on his plate, each ingredient doing its part. One day, inspired by a recipe he found in an old wellness book, Dylan blended papaya with plain Greek yogurt, a handful of blueberries, and a drizzle of honey. The result was creamy, refreshing, and satisfying enough to carry him well into the afternoon. The yogurt brought probiotics, supporting the healthy bacteria in his gut. The blueberries added anthocyanins, powerful antioxidants known for protecting the brain and eyes. And the honey offered natural antibacterial properties. Together, they made a team that was far more powerful than papaya alone. As his experiments continued, Dylan noticed something interesting. The more thoughtfully he paired his papaya, the more energized he felt throughout the day. There was no heaviness, no mid-morning crash. His skin seemed a little brighter, and even his mood felt steadier. It was as if his body was thanking him for the extra variety and balance. One pairing quickly became his favorite, papaya blended with a small knob of fresh ginger and a splash of coconut water. The ginger brought a gentle heat and anti-inflammatory power, while the coconut water added electrolytes for hydration. It was perfect after his morning walks, leaving him refreshed and ready for the day. He shared his discoveries with Claire one weekend over breakfast. She raised an eyebrow at the papaya yogurt blueberry mix he served her, but took a bite and smiled. "Okay, I'll admit it. This is really good," she said, going in for another spoonful. Dylan laughed and told her about all the little combinations he'd been trying. "It's like the fruit's telling me it doesn't want to work alone anymore," he joked. Through these experiments, Dylan realized something important. Pairing foods wasn't about making papaya more interesting. It was about synergy, the way certain nutrients could work together to amplify each other's effects. And for someone his age, that kind of teamwork mattered. It wasn't just about eating enough vitamins and minerals, it was about helping his body absorb and use them effectively. Now his mornings had more variety than ever. Some days it was simple papaya with lime. Other days it was papaya with chia seeds and a dollop of yogurt. And sometimes it was a full smoothie with ginger, coconut water, and a touch of honey. Each choice felt intentional, a small step toward building resilience and strength in a body that, while aging, still had plenty of life and vitality left. What had started as a quiet experiment had turned into a joyful habit. And as Dylan sat at his kitchen table one morning, sipping a glass of papaya ginger smoothie, he couldn't help but feel grateful. Not just for the fruit, but for the journey, the small discoveries that together had transformed his relationship with food. The first light of dawn slipped through Dylan's curtains as it always did, soft and pale, but this morning it found him already awake. He stood barefoot in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cool knife, the familiar weight of a perfectly ripe papaya resting on the wooden board. Months had passed since that confused morning of bloat and frustration, yet the memory felt distant, like an old photograph gently fading at the edges. What remained was this moment, steady and unhurried, a ritual so natural it felt as though it had always belonged to him. He sliced the fruit in half, watching the blade glide through the orange flesh, seeds shimmering like onyx beads beneath the light. A quiet satisfaction bloomed in his chest. No longer was this a guessing game of ripeness, timing, or pairing. He knew the gentle give to look for under his thumb, the sweet but not fermented scent that signaled the perfect window. He knew how his stomach would greet the first bite, without fear, without heaviness, just a welcome calm that would ripple through the rest of his day. That calm, he realized, had become the silent backdrop to everything else he did. Not long ago, he'd scheduled a follow-up appointment with his doctor, more out of curiosity than concern. As Dylan sat on the exam table answering the routine questions, he felt an easy confidence he hadn't known in years. The numbers on the lab sheet soon mirrored his feelings, cholesterol edging downward, fasting glucose comfortably stable, inflammatory markers a shade lower than before. The doctor raised an eyebrow, tapped the chart, and asked what had changed. Dylan smiled, almost sheepish, and spoke of a simple morning habit, one fruit, one moment of focus, that had nudged everything else into place. The doctor listened, arms folded, then offered a thoughtful nod. "You'd be surprised how often small, consistent choices do more than complicated regimens," he said. "Most people look for a pill or a program. You found a practice." Dylan let the words sink in. A practice. That was what this truly was. A conversation he held with his body every morning, humble and predictable, yet quietly powerful. No heroic diets, no extreme fasts, just consistency, respect, and a willingness to learn from yesterday's discomforts. Later that month, Claire convinced him to share his experience at the community center's senior wellness night. At first, Dylan hesitated. He wasn't a nutritionist, and he certainly wasn't looking to lecture anyone, but she reminded him how many neighbors still struggled with digestion, energy dips, and the confusion of conflicting health advice. So he agreed, and one crisp evening, he stepped up to a small podium, papaya in hand, and told his story. He spoke of bloating and overripe pitfalls, of timing and tiny seeds, of how an everyday fruit had taught him to pause and listen. Heads nodded, a few eyes widened when he described the first time he realized his beloved habit was backfiring. By the end, several attendees were already swapping tips on where to find the best papayas in town. Walking home that night, Dylan felt lighter than the autumn air around him. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that his journey hadn't been about fixing one problem. It had been about cultivating trust. Trust that his body still had wisdom to share. Trust that change didn't demand grand gestures, only gentle persistence. Trust that something as small as a morning slice of fruit could stand guard over the winding hours of a day and quietly shape them for the better. In the months that followed, the papaya ritual became more than breakfast. It was a compass. On hectic days, it reminded him to slow down. On low days, it reminded him he could restart from something simple and nourishing. And on the bright, easy days, it doubled the joy, because good moments tasted sweeter when they began with intention. Friends who once teased him for vacation fruit in winter now asked for his ginger papaya smoothie recipe. Claire started keeping a bowl of firm, freckled papayas on her own counter, a silent link between father and daughter across busy weeks. One snowy morning, as Dylan watched flakes blur the garden outside, he realized the truest measure of his progress wasn't in lab results or lost discomforts. It was in how ordinary the ritual felt now, unremarkable, almost invisible, woven into the fabric of living like the act of breathing or tying one's shoes. That invisibility was its power. The habit demanded so little thought that it left room for everything else: walks with Claire's children, afternoons of woodworking, evenings of laughter with Harold. His health no longer occupied center stage, it quietly supported the life unfolding upon it. Looking back, Dylan could trace each turning point: the first uneasy bloating, the doctor's candid warning, the lesson of overripe sweetness gone sour, the green papaya's latex sting, the awakening to papain's dual nature, and finally the discovery that pairing, timing, and seeds could turn a problematic fruit into a daily ally. Each step had felt small in the moment, but together they mapped a gentle arc from confusion to clarity, doubt to confidence, imbalance to harmony. And so, with the snow still falling, Dylan lifted a forkful of papaya, let its morning brightness settle on his tongue, and closed his eyes in quiet gratitude. A simple habit, yes, but one that had given him back ease in his stomach, steadiness in his energy, and faith in the body that carried him forward. In that single, unhurried bite, he tasted the lesson he hoped others might one day taste for themselves: that health often hides in the smallest acts we repeat, the ones so easy to overlook yet powerful enough to change the way we live, one mindful morning at a time. Looking back, Dylan's journey with papaya wasn't just about a fruit, it was about learning to listen to his body, to notice the small changes before they became big problems. He began this path believing papaya was an unquestionable good, a sweet slice of health on his breakfast plate. But along the way, he discovered that even the healthiest things need respect, timing, and understanding. He learned how overripe fruit could turn from a healer to a troublemaker, how eating papaya right after heavy meals could backfire, how unripe green papaya, eaten raw, carried hidden risks, and even how the very enzyme that made papaya special could cause trouble for some. Through it all, Dylan didn't give up on the fruit. Instead, he found the way to make it work for him, eating it at the right time, in the right form, and in harmony with his body's needs. For Dylan, this was more than a dietary adjustment. It was a reminder that our relationship with food should be thoughtful and personal, that we can't assume what worked for us years ago will work forever, and that caring for ourselves often means slowing down, paying attention, and making small but powerful changes. If you're watching this and you're in your 50s, 60s, or beyond, let Dylan's story be a gentle nudge. Don't wait for discomfort to push you into change. Listen now, notice how your body responds. Experiment, adjust, because health isn't built from grand gestures alone. It's shaped in the quiet choices we make every day. The foods we choose, the timing we honor, the respect we give to our own well-being. And sometimes those choices can be as simple and as sweet as learning to eat a papaya the right way.